Well, our study is in Samuel, and our central truth is God remains faithful even when we fail Him. Our focus is perceive how Israel rebelled against God and submit to God's will. It's around 1030 BC in Ramah, Beersheba, Mizpah, and Gibeah. And our golden text is, "The Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should reign over them." 1 Samuel 8:7, a very sad verse. We'll begin by asking everyone how their week's been. Real quick, just how God's blessed you this week. I don't want to take super long because we want to get through His lesson as much as possible, but I'll just go through everybody because I know God's blessed you. And we'll start with you. How's that? Praise the Lord. Three things that were involved as far as people that serve, God over that. That's three things already. They're on two feet back in. All right, what about you, Ed? A true friend doesn't pat you on the back and tell you you're always doing right. A true friend kicks your butt for doing something wrong, right? Go ahead. I agree. That's going to be even better than the other. I'm John.
think you want my dad, he turned 77 on 11. And all his life, growing up with mother, told him he never really thanked her. And I think he did despise her.
You might have doubled it, huh?
And we now have 2 teenagers driving. So we're like short of 8 people. So Tim and I took carpool, which is good because we have that time together. But my parents taught my dad to do. So that was a blessing. So now Anthony has her card. She don't have to be like, Mom, please just write it down. So he's a way maker. And I thank him for that. My mom, she's doing wonderful. She's doing wonderful.
Sorry. I just want to ask everybody to pray on Monday. We have Monday night. And he's had a really struggle on himself all day. He's straight on the line. And they're still worried about him every day.
Dearly Father, thank you for everything you've done. We ask you to please minister to all the needs of this congregation. Please touch this lesson where it sinks into our hearts and souls, and we're able to apply it and grow closer to you in your wonderful name. To get a kind of a backdrop, we are talking about how Israel had gathered themselves up to where Samuel was, and he had and the Philistines decided that was a good time for them to attack. The Philistines attack. Instead of relying on themselves, Israel asks Samuel to pray. God thunders a great thunder, the Bible says, causing the Philistines to be disillusioned. They start running around, not knowing what they're doing, and God's people won the victory and got all their cities back that the Philistines had taken. The conclusion for last week, really quickly going to go through the conclusion and the introduction, and then we'll continue on from there. God used Samuel to bring revival and restoration to broken and backslidden Israel. Samuel stands in sharp contrast to the judges who served immediately before him. Jephthah, Samson, and Eli certainly deserve commendation for some areas of their lives, but they often were driven by their own desires, fears, and weaknesses, as are we many times. The success of Samuel can be attributed to 4 important elements. Number 1, the influence of a godly family. His father was a faithful man who went every year to the tabernacle to offer sacrifices. His mother was devoted to the Lord and to her family. Number 2, the power of prayer. Samuel was born in answer to prayer, and throughout his ministry he prayed with faith. Samuel was recognized as a man of effective prayer. Third was the call of God. Samuel was gifted both as a prophet and as a judge because of the manner in which God appeared to him. Samuel never doubted that he was called of God. As Christians, we are told to make our calling and election sure. 2 Peter 1:10. This is, that is, we must be certain that we have surrendered to God's will for our lives, and we are following the path He has set before us. And number 4, and finally, is obedience. Nowhere do we read that Samuel ever resisted God's will or disobeyed God's directions. Man, imagine if that could be said about us. Whew. I know it can't be said about me, but I'm trying my best now. I'm going to read that one more time. Nowhere do we read that Samuel ever resisted God's will or disobeyed God's directions. Samuel was faithful and obedient to God at all times. The influence of a godly family, the power of prayer, and the calling of God are not sufficient to produce an effective ministry, whether clergy or laity. We must be faithful and obedient, as we hear Samuel say later, "Behold, it is better to obey is better than sacrifice." 1 Samuel 15:22. And our introduction is, God's way is the best way. But when we face difficulties, we are tempted to question His ways, to take shortcuts, or to invent what we think is a better way. Sometimes our dissatisfaction with God's way comes as a result of envying the prosperity of unbelievers. We want what they have: money, possessions, status, power, pleasure. Christ taught us, however, that we must not be influenced and shaped by the focus of the world around us. Rather, we must be an influence for good. That is, we are in the world, but we are not of the world. It's found in John 17:16. God's way is the best way, and to stray from His way is to bring trouble upon ourselves. Therefore, whenever we are tempted to choose our way instead of God's way, we should recall the wise words of Solomon, who said, "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not to thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths. Be not wise in thine own eyes. Fear the Lord, and depart from evil." It's Proverbs 3:5-7. We should remind ourselves that the way of the fool is right in his own eyes. I think we can all agree that most of the problems we faced is because of us, and we've caused our own mistakes in many of the ways. So if we can just lean on Him and not ourselves, we'll be much better off. We are encouraged to be steadfast in our walk with God, 1 Corinthians 15:58. But still we fall short at times. However, when we are unfaithful, God remains faithful. 2 Timothy 2:13. Even in our disobedience, God continues to work in our lives to bring us back to conformity to His will. Although every act of disobedience carries serious consequences, we can be restored. And that one act of disobedience does not necessarily prevent us from fulfilling God's plan for our lives. In this week's lesson, we will learn that Israel strayed from God's perfect will. God had established the nation under leadership of 12 tribes who were ruled by elders and judges like Samuel. However, Israel grew dissatisfied with God's plan for government. They saw that other nations were ruled by kings. Therefore, they wanted a king like those other nations. Even though their desire for a king was an act of rebellion against the will of God, God was gracious to grant their desire and to continue His guidance and care for His rebellious people. Samuel was the last of the judges. Israel was looking around, and they saw that, they knew that Samuel had been a wonderful, wonderful person. And they had seen that Samuel had broke away from the old ways, the bad ways, and he had tried to go back to the old ways of just worshiping God and tried to establish his ministry that way. But Samuel did something that was actually not ordained by God. It never says anywhere in here that God led him to make his sons judges over Israel. But instead of waiting on God, instead of praying about the decision, it shows that Samuel put his sons over the people. Now, until this time, they had been pretty much just isolated to one little area in Beersheba. They had been doing the ruling there, and apparently something wrong must have started there. Otherwise, it wouldn't have grown to the entire nation when they were made judges of the entire nation. But they were isolated to little Beersheba, and a little bit of corruption there, but it wasn't widespread. But it got really bad, and the Bible says that they were taking bribes and seeking after filthy lucre, which is pretty much a weird way of saying that they were trying to get selfish gain out of selfish profit out of, and it could have been by force or anything else like that, which is a horrible way to go, of course, especially in the name of God. Which, we've seen that through the years, how horribly that defaces Christianity, how cruelty and a quest for power gets used by, and they say that, this is done under the name of God. It's done by God's chosen. Unfortunately, it's just by selfish desire. Israel looks around, they see these kings over these other nations, and all they want is security. And many times all we want is security, isn't it? We look around and we're just like, I want to have a good car. I look around, I want to have a good place to stay. I don't want, a leaky roof and this, that, and the other. I want to have this, I want to have that, because I want to have a good spouse. It's because we want security. And God says, hey, I've got all the security you need. You stay with me, and you don't have to worry about that stuff. You and me are bigger than you and 7 armies. It's all you need. But they looked around, all they saw was these kings, and the kings would have armies. And the armies would establish the king's reign. They were able to, take things by force. And when somebody came against them, the army was automatically called. So everybody didn't have to lay down their plows in the shed or anything and go out and fight the battle by themselves. Because until this point, if they went to battle, everybody went to battle. But, except for the most likely the women and the children were hidden off, and there were some cases where the women would hide up on the walls and throw things down off the walls. But Israel wanted that. They were just like, man, we want a king to host an army. That way they can fight our battles for us, and we don't have to, we don't have to worry about all this stuff. The kings of that time were very notorious for being very cruel, establishing a reign through terror, and not being the best of leaders. They would just have selfish desires and want their way. Yeah. I'm supposed to use my microphone here. Just want everyone to know that. But unfortunately, they would exploit the weak and the poor. And it's just like Jimmy was talking about how when he came over from Iraq that he got to actually go to Saddam's palace, and or one of the prince's palaces. I don't know. Was it Saddam's himself? Yeah. And he said just right outside his house, just back off the yard. Of course, he doesn't want to face his land. Just out from his house, there were people living in cardboard boxes. And he could see this from his, balcony. He could look out his window and see this. Yet inside his house, he had like marble floors and these huge like brass doors and these gold fixtures for his tubs and stuff like this. I mean, this is the height of selfishness, and this is exactly what the kings back then would do. They could look out and they could see the horrible situation that all the people were in. They could see the little mud huts that, the people were just trying to keep water off their head, and they would live in these palaces, just trying to gain their own selfish gain. No? Oh, totally agree. I totally agree. I mean, Brother Mindy, when he first walked into the church, he was just like, oh my goodness, What an incredibly beautiful church. He wasn't used to what, this is when he first came, and he wasn't used to having, facilities like this. And we're blessed. We're by no means the nicest church around, but I tell you what, God's blessed this church to where we have a wonderful roof over our head. But to amplify the point even farther, don't we do this spiritually? We are rich with God's Word, with commentaries that have God's Word, literally 10 billion videos on YouTube that you can look up to try to learn something about God. And we have all this stuff, and we look at and we see this impoverished world. We see all these people that don't have any idea what's going on. They have no idea the depth of Scripture. All they hear is those famous little lines, well, church is just full of hypocrites. That's all they hear. That's all they're surrounded with. They're surrounded with ignorance because they have no idea what God can actually do for them. But we sit in our pious little church palace. We feed ourselves on the Word. We come and listen to singing. We listen to preaching. And we try to apply it to our lives, but that's not what we're called to do. Yes, that's basic. That's basic. As God's people, we're supposed to have that applied to our lives. But as His chosen, our calling is to go and spread it out to the world. Just food for thought. Yes, it's by Zach Coonan. A spiritual leader will first and foremost have a calling from God. His work will not be his profession, but his calling. So as not just to be good at his profession, but it's what he's called to do. It is. Well, that's a very good point that I was going to bring out a little bit later, but we're not going fast enough already. But I see reflections of Eli. I see reflections of Samuel's parenting from Eli's parenting. You see, Eli raised up Samuel in the church, and all this time, I have a tendency to believe that Eli saw Samuel's heart. He wanted, he really wanted it, but unfortunately, by nurturing Samuel up in the Word, I think he had maybe a little bit of neglect. But where Eli didn't do a very good with leading God's people and his sons there, but he did a great job with Samuel. Samuel did a great job with the nation. But unfortunately, some of that parenting from Eli kind of rubbed off. And his sons ended up, well, we haven't got to that verse yet. So, sorry, I'm babbling too much here, obviously. God had established a way to make the nations only serve Him as king. He had made it to where, well, there's a wonderful excerpt in here. It says, God Himself served as Israel's king. The 12 tribes of Israel would come together under the common bond of worship at the tabernacle and under the common leadership of the priests, the prophets, the elders, and the judges. This new form of government would prevent any concentration, now listen to this, would prevent any concentration of power in the hands of a few people and would thus ensure freedom from oppression. What a wonderful thing. They had the absolute best system going. Why? Because God made it. He knows what the best system is. He made this system to where people wouldn't have, like they said, one person wouldn't be held with all the power. And that's exactly what happens in a lot of these countries with the banks and stuff like that. They get all the money, and then money controls the world, and the banks control that. But that's what's happening with these kings as well. All the kings control the money, and if they had a bad day, and somebody made them mad, well, off their head. It's not a good thing. Would someone please read verses 1 through 3?
Made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second, Levi. They were judges in Shechem, and his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after Lucifer and took bribes and early gifts.
Samuel left a good example for his sons to follow. Instead, the Bible says they turned aside after lucre, which means they attempted to acquire dishonest gain, perhaps even using violence to obtain money. Yes. Church still have to make their decision. Oh yeah, they still have that decision to make. That's exactly right. No matter, you can be raised up in absolute perfection, but you have a decision to make. Every one of us should remember, those decisions growing up, teenage years, where you really decided the person you were going to be. You knew right from wrong, and there were experiences you wanted, and there were experiences that taught you some valuable lessons. And that's exactly right, yeah. But like I said, rather than waiting on God, he had, rather than searching among Israel's elders, Samuel made his sons judges over Israel, which is what we just read. They violated their obligation for fairness and equality by receiving bribes and giving preferential treatment to individuals who could pay for the judges to go in their favor, to judge in their favor. It certainly seems like it's me. So here's a little excerpt from J.C. Ryle. It says, "He that boasts of being one of God's elect, while he is willfully and habitually living in sin, is only deceiving himself and talking wicked blasphemy." And like I said, the Israelites thought the grass was greener on the other side. And that leads us into verses 5 through 6. Would someone please read that? 4 through 6, yes.
And all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel to Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy son will come in thy place. And thou makest a king to judge us like all nations. But the thing displeased Samuel, and they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed.
Why would that displease Samuel? Very good point. I tend to think of it as there was two different options that Samuel had to get mad at. He could take it jealously, like, they were talking bad about his sons, or he could take it spiritually, like they were trying to go against God's plans, and Samuel chose the right one. I'll go ahead and tell you. I'm sure that was an inner conflict between himself, but he chose the right thing, and he went to God in prayer. The Bible says that he went to the Lord in prayer. So the failure of Samuel's sons, the incredibly bad example that they were setting and the bribes that they were taking was obviously very unjust, and it caused the children of Israel to want another form of government. They decide that, we've got to have something different here. We're tired of this system, Samuel hadn't been out for very long, I don't believe. I don't know exactly, it doesn't say exactly how long his sons had been judges, but it hadn't been very long, and Israel already could see from their past that as long as they were in line with God, God took care of their battles. But when they weren't in line with God, they got burned. So I have a tendency to think that Israel was looking a little bit more toward the selfish side of this. They're like, well, if we have a king, we'll always have an army. And they'll be trained up, and they'll be able to do this, because they're worried about the Philistines, like we talked last week. But God had created a nation that was different from all the other people. We're supposed to be a peculiar people. But demonstrating his great spiritual depth, Samuel's response to their request was to pray to the Lord. Whenever faced with opposition or criticism, prayer is always in order. A spiritual leader will always rely on God. John Stott wrote this: "The authority by which the Christian leader leads is not power, but love. Not force, but example. Not coercion, but reasoned persuasion. Leaders have power, but power is safe only in the hands of those who humble themselves to serve." That's wonderful. I don't know what book that is, but I'd like to read that book. Was the Israelites' demand justifiable? Exactly what I wrote down. The only way it's justifiable is only by humans. If you look at it through these little, contact lenses or whatever you're looking through, we can see that we want security. We want security. I'm supposed to use this microphone. We want security, and we want to feel safe all the time. So naturally, a 24/7 army ready to go, at the drop of a hat, well, that seems good, pretty good. But it is not justifiable because it went against God's plan and to keep God as the only king of Israel. Someone, please read verses 7 through 9. Isn't it amazing how God cares about every little thing? How He cares about every single little feeling that you feel. You got to realize, Samuel had done a wonderful job. Samuel's decision to put his sons in was a bad one. But God knew how Samuel felt. Samuel felt like a loser about this time. You got to realize. You have the entire nation of Israel asking for a different form of government after Samuel had done such a wonderful job. So Samuel's there thinking, man, I just don't feel that good about all this. I'm sure he had anxiety, and it's just, I'm sure it was just ripping him apart inside. But what does God say? He addresses Samuel's anxiety by explaining that the people have not rejected Samuel, but they have rejected the Lord. The rejection of God's preferred form of government was a rejection of God's authority and leadership. Yes.
Does something wrong. You'll look and say, where did I fail? How did I feel like I'm not preaching the right word? And I tell them over, it's not him that they're doing something against. That he takes it on himself.
It's going to be hard not as a leader. We're going to speed right along. That's right. Totally agree. What was God's instruction to Samuel to do? What did he say through that verses 7 through 9 there? That's it. But warn them. Give them what they want, but warn them. Every time we decide to go our own way, is there not just like a siren going off in the back of your head, just like something's wrong here, you shouldn't do this, but you're fighting it off, and you're just like, well, this is going to be good. I just, do this. Yeah, no, it doesn't ever work out very good. Anyway, the life of the prophet Hosea was a living illustration of God's faithfulness. Hosea's wife was unfaithful to him on repeated occasions, but Hosea always rescued her and restored her as his wife. In the same way, Israel rebelled against God time and time again. Now, I hope you understand the depth of that, because this was unheard of. Okay, a woman being caught in the act of adultery was oftentimes stoned to death. She was killed there. Okay, so him, by God leading him to take her and to receive her back and back and back and back again, he was showing a horrible but good life lesson for Israel. Anyway, Israel rebelled against God time after time, but despite their unfaithfulness, God continued to be faithful to his people. The New Testament puts it this way: if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. God made us free agents. We have our own decisions to make. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go very quickly. And Samuel told, I'm reading verses 10 through 11 right now. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king. And he said, this will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen. And some shall run before his chariots. Why is that a big deal? Who's the target? I'm sorry, but you can see, 100 guys lined up, but you see this one guy with a big crown, with a large chariot, and people running around his chariot. Who are you going to go after? You're going to go after the guy in the chariot and whoever's guarding the chariot. So that's a pretty big deal. Yes. Did you have Oh, you did. Okay. The warnings that Samuel gave them was that he would take your children, take your land, and your. I'm sorry, I haven't read that yet. Let me read on to verses 10 and 11. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king. And he said, yes, I just read that. I'm sorry. I'm trying to go too fast for my brain. And the warnings that he gave was that he would take their land and their property and their animals and end up taxing them heavily and taking their money. Yes, we are. And what? And go ahead and read verse. Yes, I read this out of the Bible. And that's why I'm having a hard time, because they're leaving out some of the they jump. Anyway, someone read verse 18, please. Anyone have verse 18 in the Bibles real quick? Samuel gave a prophecy right then. He just told them that on that day when he would take your children and take your land for his own use, and when he attacks you heavily, you're going to cry out. You're going to be like, "Oh God, why did this happen to me?" But he's saying this is going to happen because of the king that you asked for. And I'm giving you this warning before you have a king, so you can make the right decision now. So this is what's going to happen. You make your decision, because in that day when you're crying out, God's not going to hear you. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. I've done that many times. Not Samuel, but God. And they said, "Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us, and go out before us and fight our battles securely," just like we had talked about. All of Samuel's warnings fell on deaf ears, which brings me back to Jim. How many times do you think that when he's talking and he's trying to give out warnings from the Bible, does he feel like it just falls on deaf ears? Yeah, hopefully sometimes it's, well received, but I'd say it's probably a mixed emotion just about every service. He probably feels like some really take hold. It feels like some just... Apparently, the Israelites had become afraid of the Philistines and believed that their security rested in the establishment of a strong military. However, even a quick survey shows that Israel history demonstrates the Lord had always given them victory over their enemies as long as they remained faithful to Him. Thus, their demand for a king demonstrates the lack of faith in God's ability to protect them from their enemies. And I choose to believe that it's more of a lack in faith of themselves being able to stay true. Because they had seen what God has done. I am really running behind again. We've got 5 minutes? Yeah, and we got a lot to cover. It's bad. Anyway, straying from the book a little bit. Chapter 9, we start reading, and we discover the person of Saul. Saul was a very interesting character. Started out awesome. Okay, so first off, God had chosen Saul to be the king. This is exactly the person they would have wanted. He not only looked it, but he acted the part. Okay? So, this dude was a whole head taller than everybody else. This guy was goodly in all his ways, especially to look at. Says he was a handsome dude. So Saul is, just the picture-perfect king for Israel. And especially their first king. This was a good start. But you learn about Saul first when you hear of his story about his dad. His dad lost his donkeys. And donkeys were not just, you think about somebody, a donkey out on the hillside, but this is, my Bible gave a wonderful little example of how they felt about their donkeys. Saul was sent by his father on an important mission to find their stray donkeys. Donkeys were all-purpose animals, the pickup trucks of the Bible times. Used for transportation, hauling, and farming, they were considered necessities. Even the poorest family owned one. To own many donkeys was a sign of wealth, and to lose them was a disaster. Saul's father was wealthy, and his many donkeys were evidence of that wealth. So that kind of gives you insight about how important those donkeys were to him. If I had more time, I would tell you about my lost donkey. S10 donkey. But anyway, yes, my 10 donkeys, 10 horsepower more like. Anyway, but his dad lost his donkeys. Saul has a mission. He's going to go find these donkeys. He takes his dad says, "Hey, go take one of the servants and go find my donkeys." So he goes and he travels through the lands. And I wish I had a picture of the map right now, because you can see Beersheba, you can see Mizpah, you can see these lands that the land of Benjamin, and you can see where he had to travel through to try to find these donkeys. And he was persevering. Tell you what, I would have given up, but he kept on going, and he was running after these, and he was riding, I'm sure, but he was trying to find these donkeys, and. But God had this lined up. He had lined up for the donkeys to be gone so that Samuel could meet up with Saul. This leads us to our next verses here. I'm sure I don't have time. Verses 15 and 16 of the next chapter, please.
The Lord had told Samuel in his ear that David was on hand, saying, "Tomorrow, about this time, I will send thee a man out of the land of Benjamin, and thou shalt anoint him to be a captain over my people Israel, that he may save my people out of the hand of the Philistines. For I have looked upon my people because their cries have not."
Now listen to this. "And thou shalt anoint him to be," what? "Captain over my people." It is significant that the Lord does not describe Saul as king, but rather he calls him captain, which means leader. Although the Lord agrees to give the people a king, God is not willing to relinquish his role as the ultimate king of Israel. He made him captain. But the Lord's promise to Samuel was that tomorrow I'll show you the new captain or king over Israel. Zach Coonan says a spiritual leader will first... Oh, we already read that when Stellina wrote this. Anyway, verse 17 says, And when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said unto him, Behold, the man whom I spake to thee of, this same shall reign over my people. Saul came seeking advice to find his lost donkeys, but Samuel had more important news for him. Make a long story short, Saul, they had pretty much given up on finding those donkeys, and he looked over to his servant and he said, Let's turn back before our father starts getting worried about us, and turns around and ends up going back to and trying to look for us and leaves the other donkeys. He said, let's go back so he doesn't get worried. And the servant says, Hey, I heard that over here that there's a man of God. And so Saul's just like, well, that's good, but I mean, how are we going to, we don't have a gift to bring them, because it was customary for them to bring the man of God a gift. And he said, well, I have, I think he said a third of a shekel of silver, and I'll give that to him. And Saul was like, well said. And so they went to this land, and they found some maidens drawing water from the well, and they're like, hey, is the man of God anywhere close? And they said, yes, he had just gone up. Go quickly so you can see him. And they go up, and Samuel was expecting him. He had lined it up. It was a divine meeting, and he told Saul, he said, come up, eat with me. And there was about 30 people around, and that's where he first tells Saul that he was going to be a king. And Saul was just like, oh, my family's the lowest of the families. I mean, I'm not this important. Why are you talking to me like this? And he was just like, he even gave him a choice piece of meat. He was treating him like a king before he even was king. They came to seek his advice, and he was giving them the biggest news Israel had for a long time. Yeah, well, I totally agree. Yes, Captain, that's what the Lord had told him to say. Yeah, I keep on saying king because he was the king. But, no, you're fine, sorry, we're running out of time there. But the time, I'll just keep on going until they get in here. The time of their feast runs out, and all the people from the feast start heading out, and it was customary back then for the household leader to walk out with the guests a little ways down the road with them to kind of usher them off. And as they did, Samuel said to his servant, he said, "Go on ahead." And then he anointed Saul, or he gave Saul that wonderful message. I wish I still had it. Turn it over here to it so I could read it. Are you still turned there? Go ahead and read it.
Said the Samuel Bible accorded to the his head and kissed him and said, It is not because the Lord has only needs to be captain over is the inheritance. And go on and read the last verse. Says, and it was so that when he had turned to his back, God gave him another heart. And all those sons came to pass that day, and when they came to the hinder, the guilty of the country of God.
All right, everybody. Our memory verse is, the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should reign over them. 1 Samuel 8.